I stood barefoot at the frost-covered grass, smoke curling into the sky, my breath shallow and tight. The scent of burning hay, old wood, and decades of memory filled my lungs. The barn was gone. The same barn my grandfather built with his own two hands in 1948. The one my father rebuilt after a tornado in '76. The one where I taught my son to tie knots and raise chickens. Now it was just a pile of ash, crackling and hissing as the fire crew sprayed the last embers. And through the smoke, standing near her silver SUV at the end of the gravel drive, was Karen, arms crossed, designer coat, and a smug little smile. She wasn't even hiding it. "Should have followed the rules, Mr. Dalton," she said, not even flinching when the wind blew cinders toward her. My hands trembled, not from the cold, but from everything I was holding back. She had no idea who she was messing with, but she would soon. It all started 3 weeks ago when a notice showed up in my mailbox. HOA letterhead, pink slip, the kind of thing that usually meant a missing dues payment or a reminder to trim the bushes. But this one was different. Unauthorized agricultural structure, immediate removal required. They were talking about my barn. The same barn that had stood on my land for over 70 years, long before the neighborhood of Cottonwood Springs was even a glimmer in a developer's eye. The barn wasn't some rickety shed. It was a heritage building, restored twice, used to host harvest festivals, community gatherings, and even church picnics. I marched into the HOA office the next day. That's when I met Karen Matthews, vice president of the HOA. Blonde, sharp-tongued, dressed like she was on her way to a country club instead of dealing with actual landowners. "The barn is not in compliance with current HOA aesthetic standards," she said without looking up from her tablet. I pointed out that my property sat on the outer edge of the development, that the barn was a grandfathered structure, that it had been approved decades before the HOA even existed. She smiled. That smile. That may have been acceptable then, but we're trying to modernize the community. I wasn't modernizing a damn thing. I lived on land passed down 3 generations, land that my family had bled and wept and fought for. I wasn't about to let some power-hungry HOA board member tell me to bulldoze my family's legacy, but Karen didn't stop. Over the next few days, she started making trouble. Anonymous complaints about noise from my chicken coop, which hadn't housed chickens since 2015. Code violations about a tractor parked too close to the road. Then came the threats of daily fines, $500 a day until the barn was removed. I hired a lawyer. He said we had a solid case. He started prepping a cease and desist letter and began pulling the original land plats and zoning permits. But we never got the chance. This morning, just after sunrise, I heard the sirens. By the time I got outside, the barn was already engulfed in flames. No lightning, no accident, no signs of a power surge or a faulty wire. Just an open gate, tire tracks that weren't mine, and the smell of gasoline in the soil. The fire chief said it was likely arson, but they had to investigate. Karen was already there when I arrived, not offering condolences, not worried, just watching. I wanted to run at her, to scream, to demand answers, but I didn't. I just stared at the smoke and told myself one thing. You don't burn down a Dalton's barn and get away with it. I couldn't sleep the night after the fire. Even after the fire crew had packed up their hoses, after the neighbors wandered back to their homes and the sheriff taped off the scene. I sat on the back porch with a thermos of black coffee and a pair of work gloves I didn't need to wear. The moon hung low. Ash drifted in the air like snowflakes. My wife Maggie came out once or twice to check on me, placing her hand gently on my shoulder, but she didn't say anything. She didn't have to. We'd both lost something we couldn't replace. The next morning, I stood by the charred remains of the barn with Sheriff Warren, a man I'd known since he was a rookie, fresh out of the academy. He scratched his beard, looked at the blackened foundation, and exhaled slowly. "No lightning, no weather, no electrical faults," he said. I pointed to the tire tracks still imprinted in the wet soil. "That ain't my truck," he nodded. "Already checked with the neighbors. No one saw anything, at least no one's saying they did." I raised an eyebrow. That was code. Folks were scared. Karen had that effect on people. Not because she was dangerous herself, but because she knew how to use the system. "You think she had something to do with this?" the sheriff asked quietly. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I bent down and picked up a half-melted hinge from the old barn door. I don't think, Warren, sorry, I said. I know, but proving it, that's your job. The days that followed were worse than I expected. While I dealt with insurance adjusters and filed arson reports, the HOA sent another notice, this time claiming the burned structure was a community hazard and needed to be removed and cleared within 14 days or face daily fines of $750. Maggie nearly threw the letter in the fireplace. I took it straight to my lawyer, David Lawson, an old friend from my college days who traded corporate law for small-town peace. He skimmed the letter and frowned. "This isn't about the barn," he said. "This is about control." He leaned back, crossed his arms, and asked the question I had buried deep in my gut. "Jack, did you know the HOA is in talks to rezone the far edge of the neighborhood?" I blinked. "Rezoning?" He nodded. "They want to push through a land use change. Turn the open buffer zone near your property into a commercial site. Word is Karen's husband has ties to a development group in Charlotte." That made my blood boil. See, my land wasn't just a home. It was the last privately held plot in the eastern quadrant of Cottonwood Springs. The rest had all been slowly absorbed into the HOA's reach over the years. I refused to sell when they came knocking 5 years ago. So did my dad before me. That barn? It wasn't an eyesore. It was a roadblock. If it disappeared, so would my exemption rights. And they knew it. That night, I pulled out an old box of my father's papers. Land surveys, signed agreements, original titles. Documents proving that our family's property predated the HOA and held certain protections. My grandfather had fought hard to keep the land unincorporated when the HOA formed in 1983. He'd even included clauses about historical use and heritage preservation. Problem was, most folks didn't know that. And worse, Karen was trying to convince them it wasn't true. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for Sunday afternoon. Maggie and I showed up early, sat near the back, and listened as Karen addressed a room full of tired, polite, overtaxed neighbors. "This fire is a tragedy," she said, shaking her head with manufactured sadness. "But it's also an opportunity to clean up and revitalize our eastern edge." People murmured. Some nodded, some didn't. She passed out a glossy flyer showing a concept sketch of a community clubhouse and wellness center right where my barn used to stand. "The Daltons have always been passionate about their land," she said carefully. "But sometimes progress requires hard decisions." I stood up, all eyes turned. "Progress doesn't mean bulldozing someone's past," I said, voice steady. Karen's smile faltered, just for a second. I pulled out a folder and waved it in the air. "These are certified documents from 1951, 1976, and 1983, each one proving this land was grandfathered in before any HOA code existed. That barn wasn't illegal. It was protected. And its destruction? That was no accident." A hush fell over the room. "You all know me," I continued. "You know what that barn meant. Not just to me, but to this whole town. We used to hold potlucks there. Kids carved their initials in the beams. That barn stood for something." And then I added, "And I promise you this, I will rebuild it." The room clapped, not loud, but enough to make Karen clench her jaw. Over the next few days, something shifted. Neighbors began stopping by with casserole dishes and quiet whispers. "I always hated what she did to those hedges," one said. "She fined me $200 for having a flag too low," another whispered. One by one, folks started to talk. And little by little, I realized Karen wasn't as untouchable as she thought, especially not with what I was about to uncover. 2 nights later, Maggie and I drove to a small house just outside city limits. There, we met Helen Carter, the former HOA treasurer who'd stepped down mysteriously last fall. She welcomed us in, offered us tea, and then, without much prompting, handed over a USB drive. "I kept copies," she said, her voice low, "just in case." Inside that drive were emails, spreadsheets, and payment logs, clear signs that HOA funds had been rerouted into consulting fees for Karen's husband's company. Documents showing fabricated violations used to push families into selling. It was everything I needed. I wasn't just fighting to rebuild a barn anymore. I was fighting to expose a racket, a scheme that had hurt dozens of families, and almost silenced mine. But they'd lit the match. Now I was going to bring the fire. I stared at the USB drive in my hand like it was made of gold. Maybe to some folks, it was just a piece of plastic and metal. But to me, it was a matchstick. And with the right strike, I could burn down the whole rotten empire Karen and her friends had built over the years. Helen Carter sat across from me, nervous but resolved. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured us more tea. "They threatened me, you know," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "Back in September. Said if I didn't resign quietly, they'd ruin my husband's business. Said they'd find something in our backyard to fine us over, and they'd keep finding things until we moved out." Maggie leaned forward, her eyes wide. "You're telling us they forced you out?" Helen nodded. "And I wasn't the only one. You remember the Petersons?" I did. The elderly couple who suddenly sold their house last year and moved to Arizona in a rush. They were fined for unauthorized awnings on their sunroom, but those awnings had been there since '92. Karen claimed she couldn't find a permit on file and threatened legal action. "It broke them, Jack." I clenched my fists. It wasn't just about my barn anymore. It was about a pattern, a weaponization of rules, a silent war against the very soul of the community. And now, we had proof. The next morning I called a Daniel Reese, a local reporter with a sharp mind and a sharper nose for corruption. We'd gone to high school together, lost touch, but reconnected last year when he did a story on veterans preserving farmland. "You got something juicy?" he asked when I mentioned I had documents. "More than juicy," I said. "I've got the fat steak in the smoke." I emailed him the files that evening. An hour later, he called back, his voice buzzing with energy. "Jack, this is enough to crack them wide open. You sure you're ready for this?" I looked out the window, past the oak tree, past the broken fence, to the scorched skeleton of my barn still standing in silhouette against the sky. "I was born ready," I said. 2 days later, a second fire inspection report came in. Possible accelerant detected near the northeast corner of the foundation. The fire marshal told me off record it was likely gasoline. Someone had walked into my property, poured gas near the barn wall, and lit it. Karen, of course, denied any involvement. That didn't stop her from issuing another notice, this time claiming our entire property represented a breach of HOA safety code due to outdated fencing and debris from fire damage, as she demanded we erect a privacy barrier at our own expense or face $1,000 per day in escalating fines. Maggie read the letter out loud and then ripped it clean in two. "This is war," she said, her voice flat. "No," I replied. "This is still just the opening battle." That week, the neighborhood split in two. Some folks, mostly the newer residents, believed Karen. They didn't know the history. They saw a burned-down barn and figured I was stubborn, refusing to play by the rules. Karen used words like community harmony, safety compliance, and modernization. But the old families, the ones who'd been around long before Karen ever put on that navy blazer, they rallied behind us. The next HOA meeting was tense. Daniel showed up early with a microphone. His cameraman stayed outside, but the presence alone rattled Karen. She opened with a speech about order and preserving home values. She introduced a new proposal, the creation of a community beautification committee, with herself as chair. Her goal? Review all properties within Cottonwood Springs for compliance. I stood up slowly, held the microphone. "Before we start talking about beautification," I said, "maybe we ought to talk about corruption." And then I handed out copies of the spreadsheet from Helen's USB. Names, amounts, email chains. Every consulting payment made to Karen's husband's shell company. Every manipulated code enforcement. Silence fell like snow. Daniel stepped forward. "I'd like to ask the board a few questions. On record, if you don't mind." Karen tried to adjourn the meeting. Tried, but the homeowners weren't having it. Later that week, we hosted a potluck. Old school, just like my parents used to do. Tables under string lights, barbecue in the smoker, sweet tea and banana pudding on folding tables. We didn't talk about lawsuits or arson that night. We talked about what the community used to be. Children played, neighbors laughed. Even Mr. Calhoun, who hadn't come out of his house since his stroke, was wheeled over by his granddaughter. And under those warm lights, I realized something. Karen may have burned down our barn, but in doing so, she lit a fire in the community that no amount of bylaws could contain. 3 days later, Karen filed an injunction, claiming we were inciting hostility and violating HOA policies through unauthorized public gatherings. She demanded we cease all community events not sanctioned by the board. That same day, Someone slashed the tires on my pickup. A rock with the word "sell" painted on it was thrown through our window at 2 a.m. Maggie cried that night. I held her, whispered that it was almost over, that justice was close. But deep down, I knew that things had to get worse before they got better. I spent the next few days preparing. I reprinted every document, copied every photo, worked with David, my lawyer, to draft an emergency homeowner petition to call for a vote to dissolve the current HOA board. We needed 75% of homeowners to sign, a long shot, but we were up to 49% in just 2 days. The tide was turning, and Karen knew it. That's when she crossed the line. They always say the calm before the storm is the eeriest. And they're right. 3 days after the rock shattered our window, things went quiet. No more fines in the mailbox. No more notices posted to the gate. The slashed tires, the late-night calls, everything just stopped. Maggie said it felt like someone had taken their finger off a boiling kettle, and now we were waiting to see where the steam would burst. I knew better. Karen wasn't done. She was just waiting for her real move. It came on a Monday morning. I was out feeding the chickens. Yes, I still kept 2 old hens behind the garden, despite HOA complaints, when I saw the envelope tucked under a rock near the front steps. It wasn't official. No letterhead, no stamp. Just my name, written in black ink. Inside, a copy of an eviction notice. Not from the sheriff's office, but from the HOA Legal Compliance Division, signed by the HOA president herself. The grounds? Accumulated unpaid fines totaling $11,250 for ongoing community disruption and safety violations. It was fake, I knew that. David, my lawyer, had told me as much. The HOA had no authority to evict me from private land, especially one protected under grandfathered law. But it didn't matter. This wasn't about legal standing. It was about fear, intimidation, Karen's last hand, and I had just the cards to beat her. The HOA's annual public meeting was scheduled for that Thursday evening in the Cottonwood Springs Community Hall, a beige brick building with a sagging roof and cold folding chairs. Every homeowner was invited. Most never came. This time, though, every seat was filled. Word had gotten around. Daniel, the reporter, was in the back, microphone on. His cameraman set up a quiet tripod near the snack table. Sheriff Warren stood in the corner, arms crossed, purely as a concerned citizen, he said. Karen entered in a navy suit and red lipstick. Judith, the former president and her closest ally, flanked her like a political bodyguard. They walked in like winners. That was about to change. Karen opened the meeting with a wide smile and a practiced tone. I want to begin by addressing recent tensions in our community, she said, as if the tire slashing, the fire, and the broken window were all acts of weather. Our mission has always been unity, structure, protection of home values. People nodded, just a few. Then she shifted, voice sharpening. But we must also address willful defiance, structures built without approval, hostile gatherings, media manipulation. These behaviors endanger our harmony. And then she looked at me, a small, calculated smile. That's when I stood up. I'd like to respond, I said. Karen's eyes narrowed. This is not an open comment session yet. But the crowd interrupted. Let him speak. Sit down, Karen. Maggie passed me a folder. I walked slowly to the front and faced the crowd. My name is Jack Dalton. Many of you know me. I've lived on Dalton Ridge Road since the day I was born. My grandfather cleared that land himself in 1947. My father rebuilt that barn after the tornado in '76. And last month, that barn burned to the ground under very suspicious circumstances. I paused, held up the HOA letter Karen had sent, demanding I remove the hazard or face daily fines. This was in my mailbox 3 days after the fire. No expression of concern, no investigation, just a threat. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Then I held up the USB drive. This contains financial records, email correspondence, and internal memos, proving that our HOA board, led by Karen Matthews and Judith Palmer, redirected over $82,000 in community funds to a company owned by Karen's husband under the name Pinefront Consulting, a firm that doesn't even have a real address. I stepped to the side and Daniel played the slideshow. One by one, emails popped up on the projector. Don't worry, we'll fine him into submission. Peterson's cracked. House closes next month. Get the fire marshal to delay. We'll handle the messaging. People turned pale, then the spreadsheets, names, transactions, HOA funds used for personal landscaping, lavish board retreats in Florida, a $6,400 expense listed as community mural that turned out to be a new patio in Judith's backyard, and finally emails discussing rezoning plans and how Mr. Dalton's barn is in the way. Karen tried to speak, but someone shouted, "You lied to us!" Oh, then another, "What about the fines you gave my mom?" A third, "My cousin had to move out because of you." The room roared, not in chaos, but righteous anger. I turned back to Karen. "Did you think we wouldn't notice? That we'd all stay quiet while you robbed us blind and bullied families out of their homes?" She backed away from the mic, face red, eyes darting for an exit. Sheriff Warren stepped forward. "Ms. Matthews," he said, pulling out a folded paper, "this is a formal request to appear for questioning regarding misuse of community funds and suspected acts of intimidation." She froze. Judith stood up. "You can't arrest us. This isn't legal." Warren shrugged. "You can tell it to the court." As they were escorted out, the crowd didn't cheer. They just stood, in silence, watching, a house of cards crumbling in real time. The meeting adjourned with one final announcement. Effective immediately, a temporary oversight board would be formed and a vote would be held in 30 days to dissolve the current HOA charter. Folks stayed late, hugged each other, whispered. Some cried. Maggie and I stood by the door, shaking hands. I lost count of how many people said the same thing. "Thank you for standing up." But I hadn't stood up alone. This was a fight that belonged to all of us. All it took was someone to light the way. It took nearly 6 weeks for everything to settle. Karen and Judith were placed under formal investigation by the County Ethics and Accountability Commission, with over 20 charges ranging from misappropriation of HOA funds to public fraud and targeted harassment. But it wasn't just the charges, it was the humiliation that broke them. Every local station aired the footage of their walk of shame out of the community center. Her red lipstick, once a symbol of intimidation, smeared in the rain as she dodged cameras. Karen's face was everywhere. Judith's lawyer negotiated a plea for restitution. She was fined $92,000, banned from holding any future leadership position in any HOA, and had to auction off her home to cover the settlement. Karen's fate was harsher. Her husband's fake consulting company was dissolved by the state attorney general's office. She was slapped with civil lawsuits from 17 homeowners, many of them retirees she'd fined into despair. But the final blow? The Cottonwood Springs HOA charter was officially dissolved by a 78% community vote. The entire board disbanded, every unjust fine rescinded, every enforcement protocol repealed. For the first time in years, Cottonwood Springs was just neighbors again. The morning after the vote, I walked out to the ashes of the barn, still blackened, still bare, and knelt beside the foundation. I ran my fingers over the old brick footing, cold but still solid. "This is where we rebuild," I whispered. And we did, but not alone. One by one, families came. The Morales brothers brought tools. The Henderson twins, who once played tag around the old tractor, helped clear the debris. Martha Green showed up with lemon bars and 3 potted trees she'd been growing since last spring. Even Calhoun, in his wheelchair, supervised the post-hole digging with a thermos of cider. It became more than a rebuild. It became a revival. Someone started calling it the People's Barn, and the name stuck. We raised new beams together. A local veteran group donated fresh lumber. A retired architect redrew the blueprints from memory. Teens painted murals on the new siding, scenes of Cottonwood Springs as it used to be. Church bells, chickens, tractors, children laughing. One mural showed the barn itself, standing proud, golden in the sunrise. By the end of the 4th week, the new barn was up. Stronger, wider, more beautiful than before. We held a community potluck under its beams. The sheriff grilled ribs. Helen Carter gave a short speech about courage and legacy. And when the sun dipped low behind the hills, Maggie and I stood at the edge of the dance floor, her hand in mine, hearts full. "You know," she whispered, "this barn's not just ours anymore." I nodded. I think that's exactly how Grandpa would have wanted it. With the HOA dissolved, Cottonwood Springs began to breathe again. There were no more pink notices, no more threats, no more silent fears. Neighbors repainted their porches however they wanted. Wind chimes returned to patios. Children set up lemonade stands again, their laughter echoing through the streets. People began taking pride in each other again. Not in rules, not in fences. Even the folks who had once supported Karen came around, apologizing, showing up to community dinners, offering help. There was healing, and there was unity. We started a new council, not an HOA, just a volunteer group. No power, no fines, just people willing to listen, to guide, and to protect what really mattered, each other. One afternoon, long after the barn had been finished, I sat out back with Maggie, sipping sweet tea while the wind stirred the trees. "Do you think it's really over?" she asked. I looked around, at the rebuilt barn, the neighbors waving from across the road, the young couple planting flowers by the mailbox. "It's over," I said, "but the lesson, that stays." She nodded, and for a while we said nothing more. Because the wind, the peace, and the hum of a community finally at rest said enough. I've had some time to think. Sitting on the porch these past few evenings, the hum of crickets in the background, the rebuilt barn standing proud beyond the oaks, I find myself returning to the same thought. What was it all for? Not the money, not the power. Karen and her board thought they were protecting the value of the neighborhood, enforcing codes, punishing non-compliance, making everything look the same. But somewhere along the way, they forgot what neighborhoods are for. Not uniformity, belonging. You see, a home isn't just four walls and a lawn cut to regulation height. A home is where your child takes their first steps, where you plant a tree for your late spouse, where memories live in the cracks of old porches and the scent of your mother's pie lingers in the walls. What the HOA never understood was this: you can't put a price tag on legacy. They thought they could bully me into submission, that if they tore down enough, fined enough, threatened enough, I'd fold. But what they didn't count on was that I wasn't standing alone. My family stood behind me, my neighbors stood beside me, and eventually my entire community stood up. Because deep down, we all want the same thing: to protect what matters, to be treated with respect, to be heard, not silenced, to live in peace, not fear. So if you're watching this and you've been through something similar, maybe you're fighting your own HOA or you're trying to hold on to the land your granddad gave you, I want you to know you are not alone. Your voice matters. Your story matters. Your roots matter. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to fight back against a bad HOA? Did someone try to take what your family built? Or maybe you just want to say what home means to you. Drop it in the comments. I read every one of them, whether your barn is made of wood and nails or just memories and love. You deserve to protect it. Let's remind these HOA folks, communities aren't built on fines, they're built on stories. And this one, this is ours. Like this story? Hit the like button. Know someone who needs to hear this? Share it with them. And if you've got a legacy worth fighting for, tell us about it below. We're listening. Always. End of story.